The night was quiet, the only sound being the occasional creak of the wooden floor as the house settled into silence. I stirred in my bed, drifting in and out of sleep, the exhaustion of the day weighing heavy on me. My son had been distant lately, his once open and warm demeanor replaced with a quiet reserve I couldn't quite understand. I'd tried asking him about it, but he brushed it off with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Life had not been easy since his father passed. Losing the love of my life had been a blow I wasn't sure I'd ever recover from. Still, I had my son, a living piece of the man I'd loved so deeply. For years, I poured everything into him, ensuring he had the love, guidance, and stability he needed. He became my anchor, my reason to keep going. Tonight, as I lay in the semi-darkness, memories of better days filled my mind. I thought about the laughter that once echoed through the house, the warmth of a family untouched by tragedy. My chest ached with a longing I rarely allowed myself to feel. But even in the stillness, I knew I had to let the past go. My thoughts drifted to him, the man who had been there for me after my husband's death. He was my late husband's closest friend, a figure who seemed to bridge the gap between past and present. At first, I kept my distance, unsure if his presence was a blessing or a reminder of what I'd lost. But over time, he became more than just a friend. He was kind, attentive, and patient, offering me a shoulder to lean on when my world felt too heavy. I couldn't deny the warmth he brought back into my life, but something held me back. Perhaps it was guilt, the feeling that moving on meant betraying my husband's memory. Or perhaps it was fear, a nagging suspicion that happiness wasn't meant to last. My son had always been perceptive, picking up on my emotions even when I tried to hide them. Recently, though, his perceptiveness seemed to have shifted into something sharper, almost wary. He watched me more closely, his questions carrying an edge I couldn't quite place. I knew he was adjusting to the idea of me moving on, but I didn't realize how deeply it was affecting him. As the clock ticked past midnight, I heard a soft knock at my door. My son stood there, his silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, are you awake?" I sat up, my heart heavy with concern. "What's wrong?" I asked gently. He didn't answer right away, instead crossing the room and sitting on the edge of my bed. For a moment, we sat in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled. "I just miss Dad," he said, his words cutting through the quiet like a knife. I reached for his hand, holding it tightly. "I miss him too," I whispered, my voice breaking. In that moment, the distance between us felt insurmountable. I realized then that the bond we shared, once so unshakable, had been strained by wounds neither of us knew how to heal. The following days brought a change I hadn't anticipated. I ran into someone I hadn't seen in years, my late husband's closest friend. He had always been there, a steady presence during the most tumultuous days of my grief, but time and distance had pulled us apart. Seeing him again felt like revisiting an old chapter, one filled with comfort and safety I hadn't felt in years. We talked for hours, catching up on everything we had missed in each other's lives. There was an ease to our conversations, a warmth that made me forget how guarded I'd become over the years. He shared stories about my husband I had never heard before, his voice filled with affection and reverence. It felt good, almost too good, to remember him this way, not as a loss, but as someone who had lived, laughed, and loved. Over time, our conversations deepened. He started coming over more often, and with each visit, I felt myself opening up in ways I hadn't thought possible. I told him about the challenges of raising my son alone, the nights I spent crying in silence, and the fear that I would never be enough for the child who depended on me so completely. He listened, really listened, and for the first time in years, I felt seen. There were moments when I caught myself smiling more, laughing at things I would have brushed off before. I wasn't sure if it was his presence or the realization that life didn't have to remain a constant state of mourning. He brought light into the corners of my life I had left untouched, and with that light came a flicker of hope, a feeling I had almost forgotten existed. But with that hope came uncertainty. My son noticed the change in me, and his reaction was far from what I had expected. He grew quieter, retreating into himself in a way that felt almost punitive. When I asked him what was wrong, he gave me vague answers or shrugged it off entirely. It hurt to see him like that, but I told myself he just needed time to adjust. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, I noticed him watching me, his gaze filled with something I couldn't quite place. "Is he going to be around a lot now?" he asked suddenly, his tone even but his words loaded. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "He's just a friend," I said carefully. "Someone who's helped me through a lot." He looked at me for a long moment before nodding, but the conversation left me unsettled. It was clear that my son was struggling to process what was happening, but I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us. I wanted him to see that this wasn't about replacing his father. It was about finding a way to move forward while still honoring his memory. The weight of his silent disapproval stayed with me, casting a shadow over the joy I had begun to rediscover. Even as my bond with my husband's friend grew stronger, I couldn't ignore the growing distance between me and my son. It was as if my heart was being pulled in two different directions, and I didn't know how to reconcile the two. It was late, and the house was silent. I had just settled into bed when I heard voices. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then I recognized my son's voice, muffled but tense. I got up quietly and followed the sound to the living room, where he was speaking in hushed tones to my late husband's friend. "I know what you did," my son said, his voice sharp and trembling with anger. The man tried to respond, but my son cut him off. "You think I wouldn't find out? You think you could just walk in here like nothing happened?" I froze, my heart racing as I listened. What was he talking about? The friend's voice was calm, but defensive. "It's not what you think," he said. "There's more to the story." "No," my son interrupted. "You betrayed him. You were supposed to be his best friend, and his voice cracked, and I could hear the pain behind his words. I stepped into the room, my presence startling them both. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. My son turned to me, his face a mix of anger and hurt. "Did you know?" he asked. "Did you know what he did to Dad?" I looked at him, confused and alarmed. "What are you talking about?" He turned to the man, demanding answers. Reluctantly, the truth came out. Years ago, during a business deal gone wrong, my late husband had been betrayed by someone he trusted. That betrayal had cost him his career and, eventually, his health. The man standing in my living room, the man I had started to let into my heart, had played a role in that betrayal. I felt the ground shift beneath me as the weight of his words sank in. I turned to the man, disbelief and anger surging through me. "Is it true?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, regret etched into his features. "It's not that simple," he said. "I made a mistake, one I've regretted every day since. But I never meant for it to end the way it did." My son stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You don't get to excuse what you did. You don't get to come back here and pretend to care about us." The man looked at me, his eyes pleading. "I wanted to make things right," he said. "I thought if I could be there for you, for your son, maybe I could atone for what I'd done." I felt torn apart, caught between the betrayal of the past and the bond we had formed in the present. My son looked at me, his expression filled with a mix of pain and betrayal. "How can you even think about forgiving him?" he asked. I had no answer. The man I had begun to trust had become a stranger, and the son I had always leaned on now looked at me as if I had let him down. The room was heavy with emotions too raw to untangle, and I realized that no matter what I chose, something would be lost. The house was quiet again, but the silence this time felt heavier, like a weight pressing down on every corner. I sat alone, replaying everything that had unfolded. My son had stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him, while the man I thought I could trust left without another word. I felt hollow, caught between the past I couldn't change and a present that now felt impossible to navigate. Hours passed before I finally found the courage to confront my son. I knocked gently on his door, waiting for a response that didn't come. Taking a deep breath, I opened it and found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring down at his hands. He didn't look up as I entered. I didn't know. I began softly, my voice trembling. I had no idea what he had done. He looked at me then, his eyes red but fierce. How could you not? How could you let someone like that into our lives? I sat beside him, feeling the distance between us even as we shared the same space. I trusted him because I needed to believe there was still good in this world, I said. After your father, I was so lost. I didn't think I'd ever feel anything again. And when he showed up, it felt like a lifeline. He shook his head, his voice breaking. He destroyed Dad. How can you just forget that? I haven't forgotten, I said firmly. And I never will. But I also know that holding on to anger won't bring your father back. It won't undo the pain, and it won't heal what's broken between us. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I just don't want to lose you too. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. You won't, I promised. I'm here, and I'll always be here. We'll figure this out together, one step at a time. The next day, I called the man. I told him we needed to talk, not for the sake of rekindling anything, but for closure. When he arrived, the tension was palpable. My son stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, watching every move. I need to hear the truth, I said. All of it. He nodded, his voice heavy with regret as he recounted the events that led to my husband's downfall. He admitted his mistakes, the greed that had blinded him, and the guilt that had haunted him ever since. He didn't ask for forgiveness, only understanding. When he finished, I looked at him, my heart heavy but clear. I appreciate your honesty, I said. But I can't build a future on a foundation of betrayal. My son is my priority, and I won't do anything to jeopardize the trust we're trying to rebuild. He nodded, tears in his eyes, and left without another word. That evening, my son and I sat together, the air between us lighter than it had been in weeks. I'm proud of you, he said quietly, for choosing us. I smiled, pulling him into a hug. You'll always come first, I said. And in that moment, I knew we would be okay. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but we had each other, and that was enough.